While Al-Jolani's extremist HTS rebel group is currently the face of the revolution in Syria, the opposition to the ousted Assad regime has been fragmented. Some fear that its most radical force, the Islamic State terrorist group, could use the current fragility in Syria to rebuild its capabilities, as US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Monday.
History shows how quickly moments of promise can descend into conflict and violence. ISIS will try to use this period to reestablish its capabilities, to create safe havens. As our precision strikes over the weekend demonstrate, we are determined not to let that happen, and will continue to protect our personnel against any threats from any quarters. The Syrian people have endured so much suffering. We have work to do to ensure that they endure no more.
To discuss these potential threats, we're joined now by Behnam Taleblu, who's with the Foundation for Advanced Democracies in Washington, D.C. Great to have you with us. The Islamic State, or ISIS, once controlled big parts of Syria and was then massively decimated, but it never completely disappeared. Can you start by telling us more about what is left and why?
It's a pleasure to be with you. Listen, this is one of the things that has united the transatlantic community to focus their attention on the counterterrorism mission previously in large swaths of Iraq and in large swaths of Syria. So the potential for a group like ISIS, which has done deplorable and heinous and horrendous things against military and civilian populations alike across both sides of that border, the risk of such a group reconstituting is high, and that's why the U.S. and many members of that large international coalition that were instrumental in reducing the scale and scope of ISIS territory, leaving it to just a few fragments of territory in the central desert and towards the east of Syria today, where they control, plus, of course, the fact that they have about 10,000 plus or minus a few hundred fighters in SDF-controlled prisons in that country as well, means that we have to be very vigilant about the potential for chaos to allow this group, again, the same kind of oxygen to grow their fire of instability in the region.
And so then are these remaining pockets a serious danger to a peaceful Syria?
Indeed, there's lots of serious dangers to a peaceful Syria, whether that's whether people who have been using guns to get into government will put down guns once they have government, about the views, values, and interests of large swaths of the Syrian population, which have remained largely peaceful as the revolution turned into a civil war, turned into a multi-front foreign conflict. We have many reasons to be concerned about different cycles of violence in Syria coming out. This is just one of them.
There is interference or interest from several sides in Syria. Israel targets weapons and munitions depots. Turkey aims at the Kurds in the north, and the US attacks ISIS targets. So lots of interest, lots of people focused on what's happening here. How effective and or dangerous are these interferences at this point?
Well, these interferences by this point in time, late 2024, have essentially shaped Syrian politics and what's left of Syria's security strategy today. Obviously, of course, there's no core central government there, but the ability of Israel, for example, to go after Assad regime-controlled assets or former Assad regime-controlled assets, like elements of its chemical weapons program, elements of its missile program, elements of its Navy and Air Force reportedly today, that is a sign. The fact that Turkey has used Arab militants and elements of its own government to try to make sure that the Kurdish-led regions in the north and east do not find a way to connect with one another to form a large autonomous zone. So really these foreign interferences, which used to empower local forces or target certain local actors early on in the Syrian civil war, have now made it the defining feature of foreign relations with Syria. So certainly keep your eyes on Turkey, Israel, the US, Iran, Russia even, to see how they used military might to shape local forces and facts on the ground.
All eyes are currently, to some extent, on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham group, or HTS. The outgoing Biden administration still has a bounty on Al-Jolani and considers the group a terror group, as do many other countries. Is this about to change anytime soon?
One indeed does wonder if this is about to change, and one indeed does wonder why the U.S., which has used drones, for example, to go after many al-Qaeda-linked or al-Qaeda-backed fronts, forces, affiliates across a whole host of jurisdictions in Asia and the Middle East and Africa, for example, have not in the past few years, when there was that stalemate, go after more of HTS forces, and even the HTS leader, Mr. Jolani, that you mentioned. So certainly one does see the prospect of dangling not just removing that bounty, but even potentially a delisting as being in the offing. Is it likely right now? I would say probably very, very, very highly unlikely, but I could also not see it being a non-zero chance. So I think anything is on the table if there's a fundamental change in behavior by forces on the ground. What we can't be forced into, however, is a false sense of security where the U.S. prematurely rewards something and then you have a reversion to pretty bad behavior. And given the fact that HTS has been very sophisticated, particularly when compared with other jihadist or Islamist groups in the region, in terms of its messaging, in terms of how it's been quote unquote governing recently, that leaves a lot of room for skepticism, and a significant time will have to pass before any reward or before any significant change in U.S. policy, at least in my view, towards this group is given. Now is fundamentally the testing period to see if people will live up to their words.
Behnam bin Taleblu, great to get your insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, Turkey has played a significant and multifaceted role in recent events in Syria, having backed groups like the Syrian National Army, which oppose the Assad regime. Ankara has worked hard to prevent the establishment of a Kurdish-controlled autonomous region near its border and taken in millions of Syrian refugees. Now, Aslı Aydıntaşbaş is a visiting fellow at the Turkey Project at the Brookings Institution. That's a Washington-based public policy think tank. Welcome to DW. How much of what it wants do you think Turkey has got from events in Syria over the last couple of weeks?
I think Turkey is feeling pretty good. It has long supported the Syrian opposition, and not just its own proxy army, Syria, which is called Syrian National Army and was part of the lightning offensive, but it also has good relations with HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham, the group that had been ruling for about 5 years in Idlib, a territory that borders Turkey, and was really dependent on access from the Turkish border. It's a group that is dependent on international aid and wanted to legitimize itself because it has jihadist roots and was initially a sort of a persona non grata for the international community. So came to rely on Turkey in many ways. And I think that Turkey has taken a bet on it, and has clearly, tacitly at least, green-lighted their offensive. So Turkey stands to gain enormously politically and militarily from what's happening.
Okay,
I have to also underline that it also has been hosting other opposition communities and governments in exile and so on and so forth.
Oh, it has been busy.
It's going to have a good say. It's going to have a say in what happens in Damascus over the next term.
Okay, so meanwhile, Israel has been bombing targets across Syria to stop them from falling into what they regard as the wrong hands. Do you see any danger of a clash between Israeli and Turkish interests?
Yes, I do. And this is worrisome. I think increasingly Turkey is seeing Syria as the next theater of its rivalry with Israel. As you know, relations have hit rock bottom after October 7 and Israel's military incursion and offensive in Gaza, and Turkish government has accused Israel of aiding and abetting and creating a genocide. And that's not just been a political issue. It's also, Turkey has also supported the genocide case at ICC and The Hague. So I think now increasingly the tone that what I'm seeing is that Ankara is very annoyed by Israel's preemptive actions, both in terms of the buffer zone in Golan and taking out weapons, munitions, targets inside Israel, inside Syria. But I think that there is still time for Turkey and Israel to get to a place where they can at least sort of agree on a model for the future of Syria.
OK, so now Syria has a new government, an interim government put in place by a mixed group of armed insurgents with differing ideologies, goals and regional identities. And Turkey's President Erdogan has raised a point that must be on the minds of lots of people: the danger of the country splintering. We'll hear his thoughts and then come back to you.
From now on, we cannot allow Syria to be divided once again. We can never allow the country's territory to become a battleground once again. Any attack on the freedom of the Syrian people, the stability of the new Syrian government, and the integrity of the ancient Syrian territory will find us along with the Syrian people.
So, Aslı, Aydıntaşbaş, how great do you see the danger of Syria fracturing because of local factional interests?
I see a possibility for Syria uniting, but I think clearly President Erdogan is more worried than me. The truth is, Syria, while Assad was there, was actually splintered into different governance enclaves run by jihadists or Turkey-backed groups or Kurdish militia and so on and so forth. So it was already divided. Now I think there is more of a chance for at least a unity. But clearly Erdogan's message is also to Kurdish groups. I think that Turkey would not want to see an independent Kurdistan and would want to be part of the negotiations for the type of territory, the scope, and the governance model that we are going to see in Kurdish-controlled areas. So there is going to be a conversation between Turkey and Damascus. Erdogan said in other speeches that Turkey supports an inclusive transition government, and that's the right message. That's also what Tony Blinken has said in a recent letter. But then when it comes to the Kurdish issue, I think Turkey will want to restrict Kurdish autonomy in Syria as much as possible. And that will be an interesting three-way conversation, which will not be necessarily between Turkey and the Kurdish groups or Kurdish SDF, but also between Kurds and Syrians. That is to say, whoever is at the seat of power in Damascus.
Let's talk about Syrian refugees in Turkey. We've seen pictures of them queuing up to cross the border back into Syria. Turkey took in more than 3 million since the civil war began in 2011, more than any other country. But with the Turkish economy struggling, do you think President Erdogan will be glad to see the back of them?
It's a big issue in Turkish politics. And election after year, I think the opposition has been making, various opposition parties have been running on sort of coming out with initiatives, policies, ideas of quote-unquote sending Syrians back. So clearly something that hits a nerve in Turkish society. However, Syrians in Turkey have been contributing enormously to Turkish economy. And while, it may appeal on a populist level to talk about sending Syrians back, it is actually the case that Turkish economy has benefited from both cheap labor and the kind of dynamism they bring to border areas. Erdogan has recently talked about voluntary, honorable and timely return. So I think that is good messages. But Syrians cannot be expected to go back to their country if there is no livelihood there and if there's continued chaos there. We're still in the early stages. I know of many Syrians who are actually heading back because they want to live this moment, they want to see the liberation, but they have not yet decided to move back.
And amongst this chaos, we see Turkey-backed groups attacking US-backed Kurds in recent days. What danger do you think that poses to the transition that's currently underway?
That's another worrisome escalation, not so much part of the transition framework in Damascus, because right now this is an early phase of the transition, that is keeping the state functioning and running. This is the goal of the current transition team. There will be another more inclusive government over the next period, and then eventually a process that takes the country into elections. But as far as the Kurdish issue is concerned, we've seen some escalation in a town called Manbij. We've seen a deal whereby Kurdish forces pulled back in another town called Tel Rifat. I think that ultimately this is a space to watch. There needs to be a de-escalation and dialogue between US-allied Kurdish group STF and Turkey. And what I see in very, very loose general terms, what I see as Turkey's position there is that Kurds should be east of Euphrates and not west of Euphrates. That is to say, the town of Manbij, that they've long wanted for years. They've lobbied US and Russians and Kurds to evacuate that town. And finally, we've seen fighting there leading to Turkey-backed groups taking over. Of course, Turkey has enormous military advantages now because it can also use the airspace in Syria. I think the best course would be SDF and Turkey agreeing on a map of Kurdish self-rule and Turkey-backed groups. That map is not very far from the current map that we're seeing right now, but there's a path for dialogue and de-escalation that makes much more sense.
Thank you so much for your clearly outlined insights there. Aslı Aydıntaşbaş from the Brookings Institution. Thank you so much.